Hi everyone, and welcome to our event tonight, which is the Embodied Carbon campaign launch. Before we get started, just some quick housekeeping. During the presentations, please make sure that you are muted. We'll be recording tonight for upload to YouTube. So if you don't want to be recorded, please make sure that your camera is off. And in case of a Zoom bombing, we'll be ending this meeting and sending out a new Zoom link. Now for tonight's agenda. Rachel, next. So tonight we're hoping to run for 90 minutes. We'll start off with an introduction to the Embodied Carbon proposal written by ACAN's Embodied Carbon team, followed by a presentation from our 3 speakers tonight. And then towards the end, we'll finish off with a breakout discussion based on generating ideas on how to take this campaign further. I'll now hand over to Rachel, who will introduce the campaign.
Thanks very much, Eve. Hi, I'm Rachel. I'm one of the members of the Embodied Carbon group at the Architects Climate Action Network. I joined ACAN back in March at the start of lockdown. And the reason why I wanted to join the Embodied Carbon group was because for me, fundamentally, the things that we need to consider to reduce embodied carbon emissions, the same considerations that we need to make in our everyday lives, both as designers and as individuals, to lead more sustainable lives. These things include reusing what we already have, reducing our resource consumption, using natural, bio-based and low carbon materials, thinking about the future, and minimizing waste. So in the Embodied Carbon group, we spend a lot of our spare time on our evenings and our weekends researching embodied carbon. We're all pretty much full-time architects, and this time last year we were by no means experts, but we've pulled together a wealth of knowledge through reading, but also through meeting with groups of fantastic individuals who have helped us along the way. At the end of this presentation, we hope that you're as impassioned as we are that embodied carbon needs to be regulated. So I'm going to take you through what is embodied carbon, talk about the extent and scope of the problem and what others are doing. We'll talk about the lack of regulation, and then we'll talk through our report and briefing note. We'll discuss our demands and the wider benefits of regulation, and also how you can get involved. So first off, what is embodied carbon? Well, it's the materials and processes that cause greenhouse gas emissions through the whole life cycle of a building or piece of infrastructure. And this includes material extraction and mining, transport to manufacturing and processing, transport to site, construction on site, repair and replacement, refurbishment, demolition, deconstruction, transport to landfill, processing, and the eventual disposal of these materials and products. Now I'm going to take you back to one of the slides that we just pulled up there. This is the now permitted Whitehaven coal mine in Cumbria. It will be the first deep mine in 30 years in the UK. This will be extracting coking coal from beneath the Irish Sea for steel production. And this is a real example of the link between buildings and the products we specify and the destructive processes that are still ongoing in this country and throughout the world. And embodied carbon emissions are a big part of this. In fact, embodied carbon emissions account for 11% of world greenhouse gas emissions. More than half the countries in the world have a smaller national carbon footprint than the UK's embodied carbon emissions alone. So the countries here in grey's entire national carbon footprint is less than how much the UK emits through embodied carbon. It's also really important to note that these embodied carbon emissions happen, a lot of them happen right at the start of a project. So through extraction, manufacture and construction, and these are called upfront emissions. They're not all spread out over the process of the building life like operational carbon emissions are, which means that there isn't the potential to decarbonize these and reduce these emissions later on. It's also really important to note that if you're working on a scheme that includes the demolition of a building, then the end of life emissions for that building that you're demolishing will get added to the start of your project. So we urgently need to reduce these emissions in order to limit the devastating impacts of climate change. ACAN wanted to do more, but first we needed to understand what others were doing. So we looked at these fantastic groups who are doing some great work around whole life and embodied carbon, particularly in research, education, toolkits and benchmarking. But ACAN found a gap in legislation. There's no national policy to tackle embodied carbon emissions. It's not covered by the building regulations and it's not covered by planning policy. In fact, the new national planning policy was introduced just a couple of days ago for consultation, and there's no mention whatsoever of embodied carbon or the impact of construction on greenhouse gas emissions. ACAN also took part in the Future Home Standard consultation last year, as the proposals did not address embodied carbon in any real way. The Committee on Climate Change has said that substantial gaps and weaknesses remain in the government's set of policies for decarbonisation of manufacturing and construction, but there has finally been some good news. The New London Plan has been approved, with policy SI2 referral scheme to undertake whole life carbon assessments using the existing methodologies to reduce embodied carbon emissions. Part of our campaign does encourage this policy to be adopted by local authorities for a wider range of projects. It's a great first step, but ACAN want to do more. In order to start a campaign though, we needed to understand what has happened before and define a way forward. So in order to do so, we've produced this comprehensive report, The Carbon Footprint of Construction. This report sets out the nature and scale of the problem. It summarises the industry consensus on both lowering embodied carbon and the agreed methodology to measure. It sets out a series of recommendations with international precedents and a clear timeframe for policy implementation. It's the accumulation of a year's worth of research and discussions with a number of fantastic groups and individuals, and we've consulted with a wide range of our peers, and we're really grateful for all the comments and feedback we've received. We're all very endorsed by the following organisations, so thank you so much to these organisations. One of the main pieces of feedback was that we also needed a smaller document, so we've produced a policy briefing note, which is aimed at policymakers, MPs, councillors and a wider audience. It sets out the extent of the problem, provides recommendations with wider benefits, and it's backed up by precedents. For example, in France, they've introduced a regulation called E+C-, which has been running voluntarily since 2016. It requires the reporting of embodied carbon for all new buildings to take place this year, and limits will be brought in by 2024. It's a real example of how the UK government needs to take action now before they get left behind. And in order to help them do this, ACAN have set out a series of demands. We demand that the government expands the building regulations to include a requirement to assess, report and reduce embodied carbon with a new Part Z. The government should also update Regulation 7 to introduce carbon limits on specific materials. The National Planning Policy Framework should be revised to require whole life carbon assessments to be submitted at pre-app, full planning and practical completion stages. As an immediate measure, the New London Planning Policy SI2 should be adopted by local authorities throughout the UK. And the government should create a freely accessible UK EPD database and require construction material suppliers to input EPDs for their products. This will ensure that as designers, we have all the information we need to make the right decisions. And the government should establish a freely accessible database for anonymised whole life cycle carbon assessment data of new buildings to ensure that lessons are widely learnt. We've set out a time frame for when these actions should take place, and we've also looked back to see what's already happened to get us to this point. It's really important to note that in 2011, the British standard, which set out an agreed methodology for measuring embodied carbon, was introduced. And then in 2017, the RICS guide, Whole Life Carbon Assessment for the Built Environment, was published to give more information. ACAN are calling for the government to adopt the RICS guide right now as the nationally agreed methodology for measuring embodied carbon. This year, the government should also update Regulation 7 and ensure that local authorities can start to implement the new London Plan policy themselves. In this way, we can start to reduce embodied carbon emissions right now. In 2022, all new developments should be required to assess and report embodied carbon emissions. We need to start this now so we've got time to gather data and upskill as an industry so we can start to understand what limit values should be put in place in 2025. In 2028, the limit values need to start reducing, and throughout the following years up until 2040, these should be reduced until in 2040, all new buildings are whole life cycle carbon emission negative. There are also a series of benefits to these policies that go beyond carbon reductions. These include supporting the upcoming England tree strategy and boosting the UK's timber industry, creating green jobs in construction, forestry, production of UK materials, and science and innovation to explore low carbon alternatives, making construction sites cleaner, less noisy and less polluting, and providing an incentive to refurbish rather than demolish, supporting community cohesion. So, the UK government's industrial strategy white paper said, whole new industries will be created and existing industries transformed as we move towards a low carbon, more resource efficient economy. We need embodied carbon regulation to really enhance the opportunity that we've got here. So what's next? We need you. Firstly, we need you to start talking. Talk to your clients, talk to your consultants, talk to your colleagues. If you're not discussing embodied carbon on a project right now, start. But talking's not enough. The Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy has reported that with profit margins and shareholder returns the overriding priority for the majority of large house builders, they will not upgrade their standards without being required to do so by regulation. And that means what we really need you to do is become part of our campaign. Head to our website where you can see our Regulate Embodied Carbon campaign. From here, you can read our report, you can sign a petition, you can download the 2-pager and send it to your MP. We really hope that you become part of this campaign and we can move this forward. I'm going to hand over to Seb, who will introduce some fantastic speakers and also run you through these actions in more detail. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Rachel, indeed. That was absolutely fantastic. It's an emotive and informative introduction to the campaign thus far. As Rachel said, I'm now going to catapult the launch of this with 3 fantastic authorities on the matter, in our opinion, who are going to speak more to the group. So first up, I'm going to pass the microphone to Simon Sturgis. Simon is an architect and founder of the carbon consultancy Targeting Zero. He's widely acknowledged as an expert, an innovator, and a lateral thinker in delivering low carbon, resource efficient built environment contributions. His knowledge has been vital already to us in the campaign as the author of official policy on embodied and whole life carbon for RICS, the RIBA, and also the GLA's new plan policy SI2. Importantly, he also has the ear of many of the important gatekeepers, including BEIS, DCMS, and MHCLG, along with leading developers such as British Land, Landsec, and Grosvenor. Thank you, Simon.
Thank you. I'll take over the screen if I can. I hope you can all see that. So on the assumption you can, firstly, I think that was fantastic, Rachel's talk. I think that really explains what needs to be done, and I hope everybody supports it. So secondly, I want to thank you for inviting me to speak today. I'm going to talk about design progress or lack of. So I'm going to start with these 3 pictures here of cameras and to show the progress and design of cameras since 1955, 1970 and 2020. And as you can see, they all take flash photographs, but the progress in design for the one on the extreme right, of course, has been phenomenal from the one on the left. And indeed, the one in the middle, for example, might take 24 or 36 photographs. The one on the right will take thousands. But in addition, of course, that camera has more processing power than the whole of Europe did in 1955 when that first camera was produced. So think about the design progress there. Now, if we look at architecture over 65 years, I would argue that we are well behind the curve in terms of innovation and development of thinking. So on the left there, you've got a London Wall, a London office building, 1955, 1970, and buildings going up today. And the conceptual thought, the philosophical thought, I would argue hasn't really changed at all. In fact, the building on the right probably has a higher embodied carbon than the one on the left. Of course, it is probably more efficient operationally, but still, it is fundamentally treading the same path. We have not had the innovation. And I would argue that all of those in any event are obsolete in terms of climate change. So if we look at this again, sort of slightly more closely, on the left there, you've got a house built just before the First World War, which was built by a well-known architect at the time and was typical of the sort of things that might be found all over Europe. 20 years later, the Villa Savoye on the right there by Le Corbusier was built. And of course, in between the two was an existential crisis, World War I. But the building on the right is massively different in terms of philosophy, design, shape, color, the whole lot. It is showing enormous progress. But if we look at what's happened over the last 9 years, from the Villa Savoye to the House of the Year 2019, very little has happened. And in fact, I don't want to pick on the building on the right. I'm just using that as an exemplar or typical building of, if you like, representing today's architecture. And I would argue that not much has changed. Of course, the insulation has got a bit better. And over that intervening period, in about 1970, we had the oil crisis. So yes, that has introduced things like insulation and double glazing. But fundamentally, as a piece of design, that building on the right has not progressed to the same degree as the change in the previous one. So if we look at this, my question really here is, and this is for the architectural profession, what is it we're going to do about this? And when are we going to do it? I've showed there the Cork House by CSK Architects as a possible example, but it obviously is difficult to replicate that in bigger buildings. So what is it? What is the design solution? And we need to think about this rapidly. We have an existential crisis. It is slower moving than something like COVID, but it is far, far worse. And so, you know, we have to do something, and we have to really think it through. I show you this, which is really kind of supports, if you like, what Rachel was saying. So this is looking at the aggregate emissions every 5 years over the life of the large residential block. In fact, one I'll show you again in a minute. So on the left there, you've got the upfront embodied emissions from construction. And then as 5 years later, you've got the beginnings of pink coming up, which is the operational emissions, and then the pale blue on the top there, which are the embodied emissions in use. And you can see that by 2030, for new construction, embodied emissions are still the biggest problem. In fact, by the time we get to 2050, for a building started today, embodied emissions are still the biggest problem. Yet, as has been already said, there are no regulations, there's no really detailed requirement from the government to deal with this. We're all focusing on something which has a much longer, slower burn, if you like, and turnaround. So I'm saying that, you know, this is quite clearly evidence of how we need to be focusing much, much more on embodied emissions, and hence the call for regulation. But if we look at this one, this really applies to both retrofit and new. We also need to think about embodied emissions in conjunction with operational. We should not be thinking about them separately. So if you're thinking about retrofit in this example here, the U value is normally how we choose insulation. But the interesting thing between these two different insulation types is about 14-fold in terms of the carbon cost. This is actually expressed in joules, but it could also be expressed in kilograms of CO2. So the embodied carbon really needs to be factored into these sorts of for retrofit, because we tend to think it's a benefit only. We're not looking at the carbon cost. We only look at the carbon benefit. But we should also include life cycle, because of course, if that natural fiber insulation for some reason does not last that long, well, then we need to know about that and we need to design accordingly. So the architectural response, well, I show you this as one example. And of course, the building on the left compared to the building on the right is grossly inefficient in terms of material used to enclose space. It is also grossly inefficient in terms of the likely operational issues that come out of it. But certainly in embodied, it is really problematic. But interesting enough, the one that probably will win the prizes is the one on the left, as opposed to the one on the right, which is not that exciting, but it is compact, it's efficient, and it will do a good embodied carbon job for enclosing space. A word on cost. One of the problems we face constantly is the fact that sustainability generally is seen as an expense. And I think this is generally because it's meant new things, or sorry, additional things, like you have to add things onto buildings, PVs, triple glazing, additional insulation, and so on. But this was a study we carried out for a developer in London. This actually is a building that was completed when we did the study. And on the right there, you can see four columns. So the left-hand two columns represent, on the left with the figure 850 on the top, the as-built carbon cost of that building. And the next one, with the 506 on top, represented a range of options that could be chosen to reduce the carbon footprint of that building. It would have looked the same. It would not have involved radical technologies. It would just have been a question of choosing better materials and using them more intelligently. And on the right there, you've got the as-built, the life cycle emissions. Now, the interesting thing is that 41% reduction is actually quite high. You wouldn't normally expect necessarily quite such a big improvement. But nevertheless, the QS was asked to look at this by the client, and they said that 75% of those reductions were cost neutral, and about 25% of them were worth tendering anyway. Now, if you take that, and Rachel mentioned the figure of 11% of embodied emissions for the UK. I think it may be slightly higher, but anyway, take 11%. You can see there that there's about a third of those are there for the taking for no extra cost. So we really should be forcing the government to engage with this. So to conclude, my question really here is if we're designing new construction, and this is a slide I use with clients, and if they're worried about the business case for engaging with carbon emissions, and the question is, do we just meet regulations as they are today, or do we have ambitious zero carbon objectives? And I would argue that if we just meet regulations, we're inviting obsolescence and obviously financial loss that goes with that. Whereas if we go for ambitious zero carbon objectives, we are really reducing future risk of obsolescence, and also of the reduction in value of assets. So in terms of the business case, I think it's a clear thing. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Simon, indeed. As always, salient observations on the industry today, pointing out not what's fashionable necessarily, but more so what's necessary as we move forward. As Rachel said earlier, there are a various number of ways that we would like you to engage with us on this campaign to make sure it's a success. Currently, we're a voluntary network of over 250 individuals across 20 groups with 7 international chapters, and our strength is on our numbers. New energy is always welcome, and you need not be an expert on any of the topics to start becoming involved. And now is the perfect time to join a campaign like ours. So during the next speaker, I'm going to paste some links into the chat box where you can click to either join the WhatsApp channel for this specific campaign or join ACAN more generally, and then you can decide which avenue to take after that. So our next speaker this evening is Raheela Khan Fitzgerald. Raheela is an architectural assistant, and many know her as the coordinator of the impressive and ubiquitous Hawkins Brown emission reduction tool, otherwise known as HBERT. She spearheaded the evolution of the tool from a Revit-based embodied carbon measurement tool into a web-based whole life carbon assessment suite, winning AJ100's Best Use of Technology Award last year. Raheela is also an active contributor to industry-wide working groups in the field of embodied carbon, such as the London Energy Transformation Initiative, LETI. Her work in these voluntary fields and beyond contributed to her recognition as a RIBA Rising Star 2020. Thank you, Raheela.
Thank you, Seb, and to Simon and Rachel. I'm really excited to be here. I'll share my screen here in a moment. Hopefully you can see this okay. Yep, great. All right. Give that a moment. Okay, so yeah, I just wanted to start off by saying thank you for having me, and a massive well done to everyone who's been part of this campaign and getting it to be where we are right here and right now. It's just so exciting. And I'm going to start with a slide sort of looking at a positive aspect. So looking at the scale of impact that we can have, but in the sense of reduction rather than consumption. So imagining a medium to large professional practice, if the embodied carbon of just 5 of their sort of medium to large major projects were reduced by just 20% over a baseline of last year's RIBA 2030 climate challenge target, so the target for 2020, you can see that the sort of scale of that impact each year could have versus an average annual individual carbon footprint of about 1,000 times less. So that's just to meet the 2025 target. So that 20% reduction is going from last year to in 4 years' time for a non-domestic building. However, we're all here today because I believe we agree that embodied carbon it not being regulated should change, and that it really should be something that's mandatory. But to look at something that isn't necessarily mandatory, but a professional obligation for those of us, at least within architecture, is the RIBA Code of Professional Conduct, or even looking at the ARB Code of Conduct. So the RIBA code requires us to minimize whole life carbon, and the ARB code or the ARB standard also states that we should be informing our clients on how best to enhance the quality of the environment and its natural resources. What I'm trying to stress is that we all have our part to play, and that's across the construction industry. I'm sure other professionals will have similar codes. But how do we actually do this? So there's lots of guidance already out there, and Rachel has touched on at least the RICS professional statement. And this document, which is on the left-hand side, is really the nuts and bolts of looking at whole life carbon and embodied carbon assessment. It sets out the scope, the guidance, but it's also complemented by other guidance such as the UK GBC Net Zero Carbon Framework definition and the well-known LETI Embodied Carbon Primer, which launched around this time last year, actually. And has up to date about 11,000 downloads. So we can see this is clearly an appetite to upskill and become carbon literate. And this, the guidance keeps on coming. It's great to see. Here are some recent publications with comprehensive guide from iStruct for those who want to understand more about the actual numbers and how to calculate embodied carbon better. And then the CIBC guide that only came out a few days ago for the TM65, which is a really great step forward for the industry, as MEP is notoriously difficult to measure. And this gives a real practical and thorough guidance on calculation methodology. But once you have read or you've got to the stage where you've tooled up in this way, how do you actually put this into practice? How do you measure, reduce and report embodied carbon? It doesn't need to be something a specialist does. There are many tools out there to support the design team to reduce carbon, because that's really where it matters most in those early stages. And here are just a selection of a few tools. So most are free and available to use. For example, H BERT or Herbert. It's still up to debate of how to pronounce it. And you can see that they're across a range of different platforms, technologies. And so the assessment matrix here just shows that some, for example, are free, some are based in Revit or BIM, and others are Excel based. So hopefully there's something for everyone. And apologies if I have got some of this information wrong, but I'm sure you can contact people individually for those tools. But once you have your assessment, so once you've got that number, where do you stand? What does that number mean? What does good look like? And that's where benchmarks come into play. So we've come quite a way in that we do have industry benchmarks. And the industry has taken a leap forward in producing these targets. So we've got on the left-hand side the RIBA 2030 climate challenge benchmarks and targets that I mentioned earlier. Then in the middle, the LETI Embodied Carbon and the Climate Emergency Design Guide best practice targets. And then more recently on the right-hand side, the Greater London Authority Whole Life Carbon Assessments and Guidance and Benchmarks. However, you can see with the pink text that these targets and benchmarks are not aligned, and they have conflicting system boundaries, and the scope of elements as well is not necessarily aligned across the different benchmarks. So for example, in the middle, the LETI targets are A1 to A5. So that's the upfront carbon that Rachel mentioned. So that's the product and construction stages. Whereas the RIBA benchmark, which is on the left-hand side, is that same number. So it's still 1,000 kilograms of CO2 equivalent emissions per meter squared. But this covers all stages of the system boundaries from product to end of life. So how do we move forward from this? I'm going to talk through three key steps that I think that we really need to do towards getting prepared for regulated embodied carbon. So step one is agreeing industry-wide benchmarks and scope. So we need to join up within the industry to create these agreed benchmarks, as it's really difficult to regulate without one agreed methodology and target. But good news that there is currently a big push to get coordinated and agreed industry-wide targets throughout the LETI Embodied Carbon group. So it's aptly named Setting Industry-Wide Embodied Carbon Targets. And LETI are updating the A1 to A5 upfront carbon targets for embodied carbon in office, school, residential and retail sectors. The process has begun with consultation across across the GLA and RIBA, and hopefully other industry institutions and groups to get all the stakeholders on board for this summer. So the work should feed into clear guidance on what's going to be regulated. So what scope, what elements are going to be included? Because unless the background input data for benchmarks analysis is consistent, the industry is sort of at risk at falling into garbage in, garbage out cycle. And that is my next point. So Rachel also touched on this with the call for EPDs, so UK-wide EPDs. At the moment, the data that we use, the input data we use, varies. So a lot of the free tools will use the Circular Ecology ICE database, which provides A1 to A3 data on materials, so for the product stage. But in contrast, other tools use a paid for database, for example, the impact database, which is mainly based on Ecovent, and that provides data from product to end of life. So again, there is that difference, or the conflicting end data. So in general, the industry needs more accessible EPDs, such as the US market with the EC3 tool, and this takes investment and time. So mandating benchmarks and regulating embodied carbon could help to catalyze that move forward in order to get that consistent output. However, the final step is looking sort of further out at the bigger picture. We need top-down approach. So we need to see a real improvement in action starting from the top. So once targets have been established, they need to be reviewed against carbon budgets. So these are specifically derived from evidence-based metrics to track and keep a cap on our national carbon footprint, because the UK urgently needs a nationally read roadmap to true zero carbon construction. That's linked to a national carbon budget and incorporates these science-based reduction targets. And that will enable investment into new materials and production processes. But that may not happen straight away. So in a stepped way, we can start off by looking at that upfront carbon. So when the emissions up until practical completion, because that's happening now, that's happening before year zero of a building life cycle. And that will have the most sort of impact on climate change, really. So the time is really running out for us to take a stance. There will be a need for adjustment for what we can achieve and what we need to achieve, but looking at the predicted warming projections, so what you can see in the screen here from the Centre for Alternative Technology, we can see that even with optimistic policies, we're set to double the warming levels as reported by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, of 1.5 degrees. So we're already seeing the effects of drastic increase in temperature from pre-industrial revolution era. We're seeing droughts, extreme weather, the warming of seas and flooding, and this will only get worse if we don't put a cap on it now. But it's not all doom and gloom. So the action at local council level really offers us some hope for quicker and top-down measures. So to tackle embodied carbon equivalent emissions within the construction industry, we can see that, for example, here in London with the new London plan that's just recently been confirmed by the Secretary of State for formal publishing. So we can see the GLA whole life carbon assessment guidance coming into play in the next few weeks, hopefully. And that reporting will be able to, in time, be rolled out across the country. So this will kickstart action in a time frame that perhaps surpasses what needs to be done in order to get national regulations in place. But all that in mind, what can we do as individuals now? And we've talked about EPDs. I think as designers, we have this incredible ability to impact embodied carbon reductions from that early stage where the impact is the greatest. So we need to focus on optioneering, on those big wins, such as drilling down on our facade and superstructure and substructures, asking for EPDs from manufacturers, and you can also check in on your climate pledges on the practice pledges. So has your practice signed up for AD, Protect to Declare, or the RIBA 2030 Climate Challenge? And remembering, it is our professional responsibility to protect the environment. But to round up, the key message or takeaway I want to get across is to review, reduce, and report. So we need to be reviewing at all stages of design, reducing where we can, and then reporting and sharing that data in a consistent format. And I'm just going to end with this quote from the Centre for Alternative Technology Zero Carbon Britain publication. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Raheela. It's a stark reminder of the urgency of the challenge, but also the power of our professional agency and how much it can dwarf the changes that we also need to make in our lifestyles. Another action that I'm just going to briefly mention is we're asking you to write to your MPs outlining the need for this regulation. This is something we've done on previous campaigns you may well be familiar about. On our website, we have got a template for your MP that you can download. It takes about 5 to 10 minutes to write to them. And we've even got a link to help you find your local MP if you're not sure. And if you do this, please do let us know of responses that you get from MPs. We track and manage that, so we know how things are going and we can shape our campaign accordingly. And we have found this to be a really useful strategy in future previous campaigns like the Future Homes Standard. So our third speaker that I'm going to pass over to now is Matty Coutinho. Dr. Matty Coutinho is an architect working at the Ministry of the Environment in Finland as a senior specialist. He also teaches sustainable construction at Aalto University as an adjunct professor. Matty is at the leading edge of embodied carbon regulation as Finland works towards introducing regulations by 2025. As a campaign team, we've already been hugely inspired by Finland's stance of doing what is necessary and not what is seen by some to be possible. Thank you, Matty.
Thanks for this nice introduction. Good evening, UK, and good evening, Architects Climate Action Network, and thanks for having me in this very inspiring campaign launch. So let's start the screen share and get into my presentation then. I hope you can see it now. So I'm going to talk about how Finland is about to go towards carbon neutrality in the construction sector. So actually, it all begins from the national political goals. So we are planning to become carbon neutral by year 35 and go even further by becoming carbon negative in 2040s. And how can this be possible then? We need to find inspiration from somewhere. And a perfect example, of course, is the nature. Here we have a beautiful Finnish forest in which there is a perfect balance of natural flows of carbon. The plants are sequestering carbon and storing that into their biomass and also into soils, from where it slowly releases through decomposition and plant respiration. And we have such a nice balance. Unfortunately, as you well know, we can't say the same for the built environment. And again, I think that it's time for us architects to turn towards nature and get some sort of inspiration from the natural, to get some natural inspiration to be able to tackle this problem. And what we've planned to do is that we are about to set limit values for the carbon footprint of buildings well before year 25 as part of our national climate goals. And these limits will, of course, be building type specific, and we are planning also to gradually make them stricter and stricter. But this sort of carbon footprint side is only the other side of the coin. And I believe that for creative minds and for architects, it's very important to also look at the other side, which is how to reduce, how to actively solve the problem. And that's why we are also planning initiatives for increasing climate benefits in the built environment. And I believe that this is something that hasn't been discussed so much, but it would be very important to also take this side of the equation into account. And there is also the psychological benefit of it. I'm pretty sure that nobody wants to confess their sort of like environmental or climate sins day after day, year after year. It's depressing, of course. So I think that it's good use of the creative minds of architects and engineers and designers to turn their attention also to making things better, not only trying to be less bad, but trying to be more good. So I think that this is something that we could take into account. And of course, the way to approach this is to take the life cycle approach into building norms. And that's what the embodied carbon or embodied emission thing is all about. So in our case, we've done this so that we'll be having a mandatory climate declaration of buildings that you need to present to your building permission authorities when you apply for building permission. And there we will be looking at the carbon footprint or the emissions caused by the buildings over the full life cycle. And there will be limit values. And if you exceed those, you will not get a permit. So this will apply to new buildings, and for refurbishment projects, we will have a mandatory climate declaration, but there of course won't be any limit values because it wouldn't make any sense to prevent you from addressing indoor moisture problems or indoor air problems if you would hit climate targets. And the other side, the carbon handprint side then, is also about to be a mandatory requirement to report. There we will not have any like minimum limits. But this sounds like something that would possibly be a dream of a greenwasher. So therefore, we have very carefully selected only that sort of like sides or ingredients of the carbon handprint that can be quantified with either EN or ISO standards. And there we have net benefits from reuse, recycling, or net recovery from products in the end of their life cycle. Then we have long-term carbon storages of bio-based products such as wood. But we also have carbonization of cement-based products, which can to a certain extent help as well. And then, of course, buildings could create more energy than they consume and thus help things to evolve into a better direction. So these both are important, but it's equally important to report them separately so that things don't get mixed up. And the essential toolbox for doing all this, of course, is the assessment method. Now, you in UK, you have had very nice publications over the years from professional organizations, like guiding the professionals of how to do LCA or carbon footprint assessments. And now we have just published, a few years back, we published the first national version of that, and now actually in a few weeks we will publish the regulations of how that will be done. That's sort of taking the thing into a next level. It has some legal complexities that need to be addressed, but they are doable. It's not rocket science. Then, of course, we need to have the database, which was mentioned here in the previous presentations. And in our case, we are looking at a generic database, not an EPD database, but a generic database, because in the beginning of the design process, you don't necessarily know from which producer you're going to get your bricks from, or your windows from, or your mineral wool from. So therefore, we need to have this generic information also available, but not only for products, also for building processes, for transport modes, for construction site activities. And it's important also to include into this database the planned decarbonization of grid energy according to national climate goals. Otherwise, your LCA is going to show you very biased results. And last but not least, we need to have digitalization. This is something that can make our work so much more easier. I'm referring to architects, because there is the repetitive, boring work of going through the inventories, and that's prone for human errors. So why wouldn't we put the machines into doing that boring side of the work? So we are building we are making our norms and LCA's guidance so that they are compatible with the information that we can already retrieve for building information models. And we also plan to make this as part of the building permission process, so that the part of the climate declaration can be automatically checked from a building information model that will be submitted to building authorities when you apply for building permission. And last but not least, I'm thinking that we should think further than just look at the one building. We should think that how can we map carbon balances and material flows in the built environment through across different levels, starting from a single building, then expanding to a city block or the entire city, then to a country, and then possibly also to European scale. And I think it's important to understand that how do the greenhouse gas emissions and removals that accumulate from a single building project support citywide policy goals, national goals, and European goals. And it's equally important also to look at the material flow, because climate action and circular economy are so tightly related. And that's why we are at the moment building a digital platform for like tracking and managing all this. I'd like to finish from where we started. If we can achieve with this, we hope will be a considerable help in our quest of becoming carbon neutral and carbon negative. But that's not all. I'd like to finish by with this quote, which says that the ultimate goal for the architect is to create a paradise. Carbon is important, but we mustn't forget biodiversity. We mustn't stop in our quest of entering perhaps into a more bio-centered world, and for maybe thinking about the hard questions or philosophical thoughts that should we say goodbye to anthropocentric construction culture, and what would that actually mean? But that's for another talk. But this quote actually comes from the Finnish Grandmaster of Architecture, Mr. Alvar Aalto. And today happens to be Alvar Aalto's birthday, and it happens to be the National Architecture Day in Finland. So I'm very pleased that the ACAN network chose this specific day for the launch of the campaign. So I wish all the good for the campaign, and I wish you all happy Alvar Aalto's Day. Thank you.
Thank you, Matty. That was absolutely fantastic. And I really appreciate that you reminded us, firstly, that this is not rocket science, and we have better technology on our side than when the British Standard was first introduced over a decade ago. But also that whilst we've been talking a lot about carbon, there are much more complicated things that we also need to be considering alongside this. So I'm going to take 2 minutes now. I'm going to ask you to click on the link that I put in the chat box and follow as we actually just go and sign our petition right here and now. We thought it would be a very nice start to the campaign to bolster this. So I've sent a link to the direct campaign page, but you can also access this via the ACAN traditional homepage. Over on the right-hand side, we've got Regulate Embodied Carbon. And on the page, you'll see we've got a tab here to be, which might crash being overloaded by people. And here you can see who we're directing our campaign to, our catchy slogan, a summary of our demands, and as formatted in the letter that we will send to MHCLG and BEIS, which also includes at the bottom the timeline and the demands that Rachel explained at the beginning of this evening. So I would invite you, please, to join us signing this petition by filling in these details, and it will get this campaign off to a skyrocketing start. Thank you. Alongside this moment, we're also going to have a 2-minute comfort break, and then we are going to move into the more interactive breakout sessions. Now, the idea of this is we're going to break out into groups, looking at different aspects of how we can make this campaign a success, looking at things like politics and research and media and further engagement. So we would invite you to stay on, and we will push you into breakout groups. We will then have a session discussing this and come back into the room at the end to have some closing remarks. If, however, you would rather call us a line at this point in the evening, that's absolutely fine. We would ask you, please share our campaign, read our reports, and if you want to get engaged with the campaign moving forward, we welcome absolutely everybody. Thank you very much. We'll now take a 2-minute break, and then we will come back to the breakout rooms. Thank you.
All right, welcome back, everyone. We'll now be splitting into breakout rooms for 20 minutes, after which we'll return to this main room for a quick feedback session. Next slide, please, Rachel. We know that sometimes it's difficult having a discussion with a big group virtually. So if you haven't been to an ACAN meeting before, we usually use these hand signals to help the sessions run smoothly. So use one hand, finger up, if you'd like to make a point. If you have a direct point to make, use 2 fingers. And if you want to show your agreement with something that someone else says, you can wave your hands like jazz hands, which you kind of can't really see with my background right now. Each group will be based on a topic. And due to the number of attendees tonight, not every group will have a facilitator. If you do end up in one of these groups, we ask that someone volunteer as a facilitator. And as a group, you can select what topic you would like to discuss. The purpose of these breakout rooms is to generate ideas on how we can take the campaign further within these areas. To bring back to the feedback session, we are looking for 3 words or a phrase on what the key proposal of your group is. So the topics that we're looking at are media and press, research, art and design, events and actions, politics, alliance, and COP26. Unfortunately, also due to the size of the group this evening, you will be assigned to a group at random. But just to be clear that these groups are only for the next 20 minutes in the breakout room. We welcome everyone to join the campaign to take any of the ideas further from any of the groups. To assist the discussions tonight, we'll be using a Miro board. Kerry will post the link to the Miro board in the chat box. If you haven't used Miro before, it's an interactive digital whiteboard where multiple users can make changes at the same time. And in turn, you can see what everyone else is contributing. Each group will need to assign a note taker, and the note taker will be the one who will be adding suggestions from the group to the Miro board. If you're already on the Miro board, you will notice that there are a few sample questions already there. You can use these prompts to guide your discussion. If you disconnect or don't get assigned to a breakout room, Georgia will be monitoring the main room. So please unmute yourself and let her know if you'd like her to send you into a breakout room. This was a lot to take in, so don't worry if you didn't catch all that. Feel free to ask your facilitator any questions when you're in the breakout room. I'll now pass over to Rachel, who will do a quick demonstration of the Miro board.
Thanks very much, Eve. Yes, so for those of you that haven't used Miro before, hopefully you should all be able to see my screen now where I've come onto the Miro board, and you'll come onto a screen a bit like this. And if you zoom all the way out with your mouse, you can see that there are a number of areas on the board. So if you zoom into an area, you can see this one's about media and press, and we've started to think about initial questions that will start off your conversations. Most of you will have a facilitator in your group, and they'll let you know what topic you're talking about. But if, as Eve said, if you don't have one of us that has facilitator in the name in your group, then please choose a topic from these ones. What we ask is that someone from the group who's not the facilitator takes notes, and it could be more than one of you. To make notes, you just click on this button here that says sticky note, choose a color, and then you add your note. And then you can type into the note and it just changes size depending on how much text you put in. The main thing we'd ask is please make your own note when you make a comment. Don't write in someone else's, and that way hopefully we should be able to stay on top of things. There are also some prompts here, so for example some images to go alongside the art and design group, and you can paste pictures from the internet as well. So there are a number of different ways that you can interact, and you can also draw diagrams. So the important thing to note as well is up here you can see show collaborators cursors. If I turn that on, you can see there's a whole load of people floating around. So if you see that, you can click that button and they'll all disappear and you have a bit more space. So yeah, that's it. Hope you enjoy. We'll see you in 20 minutes time, and I think we'll put you into breakout rooms now.
Excellent. That was really fascinating to watch from the outside. Couldn't hear any of the conversations going on, but loads of activity. I've been very excitedly watching this board develop. Look, if you zoom out, there's so much going on here. I was particularly drawn to the events and direct action. But so my task now is to try and summarize the board without having heard any of the conversations that were going on inside. Before I do that though, I think it's worth mentioning a few names because it's been a fantastic group effort from loads of people pulling this together over the last year, and you've seen some of that energy tonight. But yeah, I've been part of this group that's been working on this since probably since March last year, and it's just been really incredible to see all the time and passions and energy of everyone kind of pulling into this together. I think it's important that these people just get some credit. Sorry if I start to sound a bit emotional, but you would have seen that we've published 2 reports, as Seb and Rachel both mentioned, and the people that have been working on these reports have been putting in crazy hours outside of their jobs. So I think it's worth particularly crediting Sophia and Seb right now, because they've been pulling very late nights in pulling together about 150 comments from people from around the industry who commented on that doc, and they've really transformed it into something which is phenomenal. So well done, both of you. The wider report writing team of Rachel Owens, Matteo Sano and Joe Penn have all been putting in work to that as well, and to the 2-pager. But there's a much wider group of people that have been helping, and I think a lot of credit needs to go to Andrew Barrington for the fantastic job on graphic design you've done on that report. It just looks stunning, so thank you. Finn Barr Charlison and Matt Rosier have been working on graphics. Again, just phenomenal job. It looks so good. And the wider team of contributors, so there's Tabitha Binding, Kerry Watton, Eugenia Mompo, Kieran Malik, Dominic Ely, Etienne Mares, Frederick Borgion, and Lauren Shevels, and more. We've had loads of comments from people as well. So I just want to say, amazing work, all of you. It's been a pleasure to be working with you this last year. So now to turn to the Miro board. It's a bit difficult to interpret this because I had no idea what was actually going on, but I'm just going to zoom around now. So much activity and events here. I like the idea of projecting onto the cliffs of Dover. I know that that's something that the Sun newspaper and the Brexit lords did, but look, it's also what Refugees Welcome did. That's nice. We're going to scrutinise this afterwards to find out some more events. One big event this year is COP26, and two of the groups were talking about COP. So there's a debate to be had about whether COP really does anything. But look, there's optimism and less optimism. Some big countries like China and the US are really investing in alternative energy now, and at least they're making the right noises. But reasons for less optimism, look at the track records. This is a graph showing CO2 just going up and up and up, and all the COPs are marked on it. It's like they're not even making a dent. So let's do something at COP, shall we? I'm sure this group came up with some good suggestions. I loved watching the art and design group for a bit. Dominic had populated this this board here with some images beforehand, and it was really fun to see some of the comments going onto this. Are black balloons a good symbol for carbon? How do we quantify a ton of carbon? Strong imagery. I think these kind of discussions are really important going forward. How do we persuade people that embodied carbon is a thing, a physical thing, and it's going up into the atmosphere and heating our planet? How do we visualize that? It's really hard. I liked these two notes over here because it was almost like someone was having an internal dialogue with themselves. I think that the positive messages are great counterpoint to shock doom messages. Having said that, I think people respond to different types of imagery, so targeting all of them is good to make the message get across to so many people. Positive visions here, and I love this image that someone's loaded in. We're all architects, right? Let's design some spaces. Right, moving on. We've got loads of groups to get through. The Alliance group over here was doing this exercise where you basically plot organizations and individuals onto this power chart. So at the top there, you've got powerful, at the bottom, you've got not powerful. Over on the left, you've got oppositional, and over on the right, you've got supportive. So this is a way to try and map your way through the industry and try and find out who you should be targeting. Interestingly, at one point, the timber lobby was up here on the left, powerful and oppositional. I think the timber lobby's been moved to, well, it's two places now. It's very supportive, isn't it? It's in the right place, I think, over there on the right. But important to see lots of other organisations on here that we could be reaching out to, UKGBC, Greenpeace. I like this idea, pension funds. BASE and MHCLG, they're our main targets, and optimistic, I think, to see that they're supportive, but maybe that's reason to be cheerful. Going up to research, I think research is really important because obviously we've put together this report, but there's a load more work that needs to be done in exploring the topic, and some really lengthy notes down here, which is great. I'm going to rush on because we haven't got much time left. No idea what they were talking about in politics, but I loved Seb's group's summary here. Apparently, we need to make a fair trade Brexit democracy. Interested to hear what that means afterwards. Cross-party, job creation, these are good buzzwords, and I think that can help guide us going on. Finally, media and press. Using the media, and so that's whether it's social media or newspapers or podcasts, it's going to be really important, and going forward we're going to need to use it to achieve our campaign goals. There's two mentions of storytelling here. I think it's really important that we tell an emotive story, and it's good to see people picking up on that. One of my favourite bits of Rachel's presentation earlier was when she personalised her introduction to ACAN. I think it's really powerful. So that's our Miro board. Thank you for everybody that that contributed to this, and thank you everyone for coming. We're going to go to the pub now. I think, does anyone want to say a final word?
I would just like to say also a massive thank you to Joe, who's been a key person in this campaign from the start. And Joe is the reason that I joined the Embodied Carbon group, because he described it so beautifully in the introduction. So massive thank you to Joe, as well as everyone that has been thanked by Joe. And hopefully we'll see more of you in the future. Thank you.